welcome to Trip the Beltway Fantastic. For the Palestinians in Israel, conditions keep getting worse. In Gaza, the official death toll is now over 45,000, the vast majority of them civilians. This cannot take into account bodies that are still under the rubble, which covers the landscape of this 2-mile strip. Thousands are displaced and hungry, orphaned, and struggling for health care, as none of the hospitals in Gaza are working at full capacity today. In the West Bank, the situation is reaching a critical juncture. Prime Minister Netanyahu's far-right government is now talking openly about fully annexing the territory. Right now, there are some 670,000 Jewish settlers in the West Bank, settlements that are considered illegal under international law. But the settlements keep expanding, even as the U.S. has warned against them. Now, hawkish Republican voices here in the United States, even though those in Trump's new cabinet or prospective members of his new cabinet, are calling for a complete annexation of the territory, which now contains some 2.6 million Palestinians, many of whom have been brutally attacked by extremist settlers in the past several years, particularly after October 7th. Where will they go if they are squeezed out of their homes and villages? My guest, Anel Sheline, who is a Middle East fellow at the Quincy Institute and a friend, just published a new report on Jordan and an article this week at Responsible Statecraft that talks about how millions of refugees could be headed for Jordan, and it could spell the end of the Hashemite monarchy if and when the West Bank is annexed. Welcome to the show, Anel.
Thanks for having me, Kelly.
I really appreciate all the work that you've done on this subject, and you also have just returned from a trip to Jordan, so you have a lot of context. But first things first, I know this is a very complicated issue. Can you lay out the current situation in the West Bank and some of the things that you've been hearing that have led you to believe that the Israelis are on the verge of taking the drastic action of total annexation? And what would that mean?
Certainly. So, these sorts of statements are not new. We know that Netanyahu's extreme right-wing government has been making statements about wanting to annex the West Bank, and that this has long been a goal of the Israeli right wing. However, after Trump was elected, you heard Israel's finance minister telling his staff to move forward with preparations to annex the West Bank, and that he looked forward to working with the incoming Trump administration about this. And I think the concern is there's no indication that the U.S. government would do anything to prevent this. And I want to be clear, I don't know that even a Harris administration would have prevented this, because we haven't seen anything Israel has done in the past 15 months has elicited any pushback from the United States in the various ways they have broken international law and American law and any sort of norm about what is an appropriate response to the attack that they suffered on October 7th. So I think part of what I'm hoping to achieve with drawing attention to this is the ways that if Israel were to annex the West Bank, that would not only be an existential threat for Jordan, because it would push either all or some significant portion of the 3 million Palestinians living in the West Bank. Either Israel would force them over the border into Jordan, or Israel would try to make life so untenable in the West Bank that Palestinians would flee, trying to escape the violence, or some combination of both of those. So this would not only be horribly destabilizing for Jordan, because this would be another quarter of Jordan's current population coming across the border, which would be the equivalent of, if it were the entirety of the population, I believe it would be about 88 million refugees coming into the United States. So it just, our understanding of how destabilizing the numbers of people coming across the southern border has been for our politics, or thinking about the destabilization of the so-called refugee crisis of primarily Syrian refugees in 2014 and 2015 to politics in Europe, for example. So so just and those were so in proportionally such a smaller number of people that could have such a big impact politically. So this really could spell the end of the Hashemite monarchy in Jordan. And again, this is not only important for Palestinians or for Jordanians, but for the U.S. in the region. Jordan is one of the last parts of the Levant that remains relatively stable, although conditions in Jordan have been growing increasingly dire. But Jordan remains quite heavily dependent on U.S. assistance. Jordan remains an important partner for the United States, for the U.S. military in the region, also hosting refugees that have been displaced by previous bouts of violence going back to the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, but also instances of American military occupation in the region. So things like the Iraq War in 2003 displaced hundreds of thousands of Iraqis, many of whom took refuge in Jordan. The Syrian civil war, we still hundreds of thousands of Syrians sheltering or continuing to take refuge in Jordan. Now with the downfall of Assad, there's a concern. On the one hand, some people have said, well, this is an opportunity for Syrians to return to Syria, and I very much hope that is the case, because that would signal that Syria is stable enough for people to come back to. But I think the concern is that Syria is not going to be stable, and we might even see additional refugees trying to flee Syria. So this is a part of the world where we've seen instability and chaos and violence simply growing, and Israel is not helping, not only by the war on Gaza, but the war it was carrying out in Lebanon, and now Syria increasingly taking additional territory or Israel increasingly taking territory inside Syria. And trying to destroy the Syrian military. And so the sense is that Israel sees this as a historic opportunity to try to take additional territory in Syria, in the West Bank. There's even some concern, what if the Israelis decide to try to take additional territory in Jordan itself, to try to take not only the West Bank, but the East Bank of the Jordan River, in terms of carrying out this project of Greater Israel, which has long been a key goal of the Israeli far right.
This is quite depressing. I have to ask you this: how did we go from the West Bank being part of an ongoing peace process in which the Palestinian Authority has administration over, I think, 2 out of the 3 areas, A, B, and C, to these calls for annexing the whole thing? So that basically says no more Palestinian Authority. Palestinians could either stay or go. We don't care. We're going to take over. And then add this to the calls, or at least what we're seeing are suggestions of complete Israel control over North Gaza. So in your mind, this is a taking of territory, but is this just a movement towards some sort of one state solution, and the Palestinians could either stay or go, or be relegated to some small southern strip of Gaza, and God knows what would happen to them there? I mean, do you have how did we get from there to here? And is it all being explained away by October 7th and Hamas and the need to, secure Israel's interests?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And it was interesting in Jordan because of the amount of frustration with the peace treaty. So, the Clinton administration helped to broker the Oslo Accords in 1993, which, as you mentioned, helped establish these portions of the West Bank, areas A, B, and C. As you said, area A is where the Palestinian Authority had control and jurisdiction. Area B meant that the PA had control just only of civil matters, but the IDF, I think, and perhaps other authorities also, or Israel maintained control of more the security situation. And then Area C, where Israel maintained control of portions of the West Bank, which is where we've seen illegal Israeli settlements in multiple areas, but especially in Area C. But the idea was that the Oslo process was supposed to, it created the Palestinian Authority, which was supposed to be sort of the seeds of the Palestinian state. And unfortunately, what we've seen instead is not only has Israel done everything it can to block the PA from actually establishing this authority, you have seen infighting as far as the Palestinian Authority versus Hamas, for example. Or you've seen, especially in the aftermath of October 7th and before that as well, the PA sort of acting as the agent of the Israeli state, of sort of facilitating Israeli control or cracking down on protest. There's, the Palestinian Authority itself has really lost all legitimacy. Their aging leader, Mahmoud Abbas, refuses to step down, refuses to hold elections, won't be alive for much longer. I mean, he's in his 80s, and his health is not great. So when I was in Jordan, it was interesting. I was speaking with Marwan Muashar, who was involved in the peace process in the 90s, and was a member of the Jordanian government and is now with the Carnegie Endowment. And he likened the sort of the aftermath of the Oslo process as two people arguing over a slice of pizza while one of them is eating it. So, there's still this notion that there's like a peace process going on, but at the same time, you've had the numbers of Israeli settlers moving into ostensible parts of territory that were supposed to be the territory that would belong to a future state of Palestine, just moving in. And then the IDF goes in and protects them, and suddenly they're building roads and they're building walls. And so what initially was just a settlement is now an integrated part of the state of Israel, all of these little enclaves that receive funding. And part of what's so sort of insidious about this settlement project is the ways that the Israeli government subsidizes it, that it's actually more affordable for, a young family, who's trying to make ends meet, has kids, all the realities that we all face, and life is more affordable in the settlements because the Israeli government wants the settlement project to succeed.
They're pushing it. Yeah.
Exactly. They're making life easier. And so, maybe even for someone who might not be necessarily ideologically driven, I mean, many settlers are, and they're invested in this from an ideological perspective. But you might even have someone who simply says, look, this is the reality. I can't really afford to live somewhere, like Tel Aviv, where it's very expensive, and the only realistic place I can manage for myself and my family would be to move into a settlement. And so then, of course, they're very invested in that settlement succeeding and remaining and getting the protection and resources that they feel they deserve. But it is there have been no repercussions for this illegal seizure of territory. I mean, this violates the Geneva Conventions. This is under international law. It is illegal for an occupying power to move their own population into territory that they are occupying militarily. And, the ICJ came out relatively recently and reiterated the fact that Israel's settlement project is illegal under international law, which was widely acknowledged, but it was just sort of like, yes, this is not allowed, and yet there have been no repercussions. And the U.S. simply continues to send more and more money to the Israeli government, and it's just so, as you said, like the annexation of the West Bank would merely be kind of the final nail in the coffin, as far as trying to this nearly dead dream of the creation of an independent state of Palestine. But it has been dying a slow and painful death for 20 years.
One of the things that you brought up in the Responsible Statecraft article, in the article that you just published this week, was that American voices, Republican voices like Senator Tom Cotton, are trying to push legislation to call the West Bank Judea and Samaria, or is it Samaria and Judea?
Judea and Samaria.
What is the point of this? It's particularly for listeners who are not familiar with this line of debate over what to call the West Bank. It seems to me that international law means less than biblical law for many people who just say, hey, this is their land because the Bible says so. Is that what we're getting at here? That this is like um, historical, biblical mandate that the West Bank is eventually annexed to Israel and becomes all of Israel? And why are our American members of Congress getting involved in this?
Yes. So, Tom Cotton introduced legislation recently that would eliminate the use of the phrase West Bank from the U.S. government, and instead refer to it as Judea and Samaria, which is what the Israeli government calls it.
Okay.
And it reflects this talking point from the extreme right wing of the Israeli government, and other figures, very right wing figures, Christian Zionist figures. This notion that, as you said, that this is sort of biblical land that belonged to that God I promised the Israelites. But again, I mean, this goes back to this project of Greater Israel. So when you think about how some people, going back to biblical texts, define the state of Israel, it is larger than it currently is. And so this opens a question of, okay, so is the United States going to support Israel taking chunks of Jordan, or taking more of Lebanon, or more of Syria, or more of Egypt? Like, at which point does the United States say, look, we have supported you more than any other country in the world. We provide, per capita, so much more to Israeli citizens than we do to Americans. And at which point do we say, okay, that's enough. We've supported your security, but the way that you're behaving is undermining your own security, and we're tired of subsidizing it. And you need to behave under the strictures of international law, and you don't just get to make your own rules and take other people's territory. I mean, I think the problem with if the U.S. were actually to impose those rules, I think you'd have a lot of Palestinians that would say, well, the state of Israel shouldn't have been created in the first place because this was our territory to begin with, which may be why, which could be a factor in why you have some of these people who are extreme supporters of Israel willing to kind of back them up all the way, no matter what, how that would undermine, the overall U.S. interest in a relatively stable Middle East, where the U.S. is not getting bogged down in more and more unnecessary, endless wars in the region. But it is really alarming seeing this language. And what's even more shocking is it's not only people like Tom Cotton, but it's people like Bill Clinton, the person responsible for brokering the Oslo Accords, using the words Judea and Samaria at a campaign event for Harris, which many people have criticized as that speech he gave in Dearborn, Michigan, the country's largest Arab majority city, that the effect of his remarks was so much more detrimental than it was actually.
Yeah, it's like he forgot where he was for a moment.
Well, right. And again, I mean, it's kind of, I mean, you call it a Freudian slip, but just clear that, for so many members of the foreign policy establishment in this country, they view Israel and Israelis as more human or more deserving of rights than Palestinians or Syrians or Lebanese or Jordanians, or, and unfortunately, this is the sort of thinking that has pervaded our our mindset, the mindset of the blob for so long, which does tend to view those of European descent as more deserving of rights or of, that values their humanity more than those who, of Black and brown people around the world, which is horrifying that in in 2024, this level of racism seems to be what's motivating so much of our policy towards the Middle East.
Yeah. Well, and it also goes for like our picking and choosing based on who our political allies and partners are, because I remember Joe Biden and his team calling what's happening in Ukraine, the invasion of the Russians in Ukraine, as genocide, war crimes, right out the bat. Whereas now they won't even say anything about Gaza, because, oh, I'm not a human rights lawyer. I can't really weigh in on that. But they are willing to call it as such at the beginning of that war and call it a breach of international law, which it was them invading another country because they felt like their security interests were at stake. Whereas Israel continues to say that it must take more land, it must breach UN resolutions that exist, attack peacekeepers in Lebanon, pushing for settlements now in the Golan Heights because of their security interests, and we don't say a thing. So it's the hypocrisy that obviously you and I talk about all the time, but I feel like more and more people who haven't been paying attention as laser focused as we have on foreign policy are starting to really smell the stink. Like, how can you say one is a war crime and one isn't based on who you're friends with and who you're not? And in this case, it's getting out of control. Before you go, I would love to ask you more about the impact on Jordan. So say, God forbid, this annexation happens and you have these refugees who are at the border. You and I talked offline. You said that Jordan probably couldn't keep its borders shut down. Can you talk a little bit about like what would happen? Would people just breach the border? Would Jordan have to take these people in and then ask us for help? I know Egypt has been very vocal about not wanting to take Gazans and have shut down their border. What would be the difference here with the West Bank and the potential refugee crisis on that end? Like, what would it look like?
Sure. Yeah. Well, so I mean, in terms of the difference with Egypt, I mean, the population of Gaza is contained. I mean, this is part of why, they cannot leave. There's a barrier, there are walls
So
and
it's shut
fences.
down on both sides.
Exactly. They cannot escape. And even if they did, if the barrier were breached into the Sinai, they're in a desert. So
Yeah.
it would be a even more of a humanitarian. I mean, it's already such a humanitarian catastrophe. I'm not sure it could get much worse. But the point is, they wouldn't be able to sort of make it to somewhere safe.
Yeah.
Whereas in Jordan, so they, the west, well, the border between Israel and Jordan is Israel's longest, and the portion of that is the West Bank is a significant portion of that border, and it is not secured. The population in the West Bank is not under the same level of, it's not an open air prison the way Gaza is.
Yeah.
So people can kind of make their way across the border. It's not easy, but it's certainly easier than someone trying to escape from Gaza. But in addition, Jordan used to control the West Bank. I mean, that was, in the aftermath of the creation of the state of Israel, Jordan took the territory of the West Bank and ostensibly, talked about holding it to create a state of Palestine in the future. And then Israel took it in the 1967 war. But many of those of Palestinians in the West Bank, some of them still have Jordanian citizenship, or they have some means of passing back and forth relatively easily, legally, that they could just come to the border crossing and sort of show their documents. And typically they're allowed into Jordan without much fuss. The difference, obviously, in under circumstances of Israel annexing the West Bank, you'd have on the one hand extreme pressure from the fact that approximately half of Jordan's population are of Palestinian descent. Those people would say, look, we have to help our Palestinian family members who are trying to escape violence. But then you'd also have many Jordanians who'd say, wait, this is our country. We can't handle anyone else. We don't have enough water. We don't have enough economic resources. And we should resist Israel. The way that King Abdullah of Jordan should respond by Israel violating the terms of the peace treaty would be for Jordan to respond aggressively to that violation. And yet I would very much doubt that King Abdullah would do that, given the extent to which Jordan is dependent on U.S. support.
Yeah.
And if Jordan were to itself break terms of the peace treaty and respond aggressively to Israel, the U.S. would not maintain that support to Jordan, or I would be very surprised.
It's a tough spot.
Exactly. So the thing that would be more likely to happen is that, the monarchy itself would fall, that Abdullah would no longer be able to hang on. And he's already dealing with quite significant protests in the context, people very frustrated with the fact that Jordan maintains this peace treaty with Israel. Jordan continues to get 40% of its energy from Israel. Jordan and Israel were about to sign a deal before October 7th that would have sent Jordanian solar energy to Israel in exchange for Israeli water, although much of this water comes from the Jordan River, and the existing terms of the agreement are more favorable to Israel than to Jordan. So, there's an argument about, well, should this water have been Jordan's in the first place? But all this to say that it would be the level of destabilization that would cause would present a huge headache for the incoming Trump administration, as part of the point that I'm trying to make, that Trump campaigned on restoring order to the Middle East. He's also talked about wanting to win a Nobel Prize for achieving Saudi normalization with Israel. Obama won a Nobel. Trump wants his Nobel.
Yeah.
And he and his team see that as this opportunity, and also something Biden couldn't do. Biden and his team were really trying to achieve the Saudi Israeli normalization and couldn't. And so Trump has that on his agenda. And yet if Israel annexes the West Bank, it would be politically impossible for Mohammed bin Salman to normalize with Israel. It's already going to be difficult without some sort of evidence that Israel would allow the creation of a Palestinian state, which Netanyahu has made very, very clear that is not going to happen under his watch.
So it seems to me that the best route out of this would be to convince the incoming administration that annexation would be the worst possible thing for the region, but also for Washington, because if you have this refugee crisis, we would be called in to help. We would be called in for aid. We'd have to give probably more security resources to the monarchy so it wouldn't fall. I mean, this would drag us further into the muck, so to speak, of that region. And it would, I guess, the best thing to do is to convince Trump this is not in your best interest or your new administration's interest, that Israel follows through with this. That said, that they would have to counter some of the people within the new cabinet that he's been pulling together, that it wouldn't be the best thing, because you have somebody like Mike Huckabee, who is our new ambassador to Israel, who is foursquare for annexation and has said there is no such thing as the West Bank. So, yeah, there's going to be some inter-Trump contradictions to settle first, but it seems to me that there's no way out, and we have to really push from Washington to make sure it doesn't boil over.
Exactly. And no, I mean, you're absolutely right that the cabinet picks have been quite depressing for if anyone had any hope that some of his rhetoric around restoring order or being more responsible, trying to prevent endless wars in the Middle East, the people he's pulled in around himself do not seem to be in line with that way of thinking, in particular when it comes to Israel. So my hope is that in trying to draw attention to this now, before it hits the headlines, there might be a possibility for Trump's team to signal to the Israeli government that, look, you need to cool it on this annexation talk, because this is not in U.S. interest. And my hope is that Trump would be, knowing he doesn't like to be taken advantage of, seeing the way that Netanyahu rode all over Biden. I hope that Trump is paying attention, that Netanyahu is going to try to do the same to him. At the same time,
that's how you're going to have to appeal to him. So we have our work cut out for us. But exactly. You're absolutely right. This is about a U.S. interest, particularly, and it is authentically. But in terms of convincing this particular administration, we have to appeal to his better angels, so to speak, and maybe some folks that are inside, like J.D. Vance, who has kind of broken a little bit with some of the others in terms of seeing foreign policy through what the national interest is, as opposed to what Israel's interest is. So who knows what kind of debates are going on there. But I guess, like you said, that we could maybe highlight some of the dangers coming down the road, and in ways that get through to that end. So thank you for coming on the show, and for all your hard work and promoting. You could find Annelle's piece on responsible statecraft, but also her recent report for the Quincy Institute. Can you just remind us of the title so people can look it up?
Yeah, it's Jordan on the Edge, with the subtitle is Pressures from the War in Gaza and the Incoming Trump Administration. And it is linked in the piece on responsible statecraft. There's a link to the brief itself, so you can also find it there.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Annelle, for joining us. I hope you come back.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Kelly.